Welcome to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast, where you can learn and be inspired by real-world examples of how technology is transforming businesses and reshaping industries in a language everyone can understand. Here is your host, Neil C. Hughes.
Welcome back to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast. Now, one of the things I love doing on this daily show is busting a few myths. For example, many people listening, wherever you are in the world, might have the perception that the legal industry has this strong reputation for being incredibly slow to adapt to technological change. But let me present to you Exhibit A. Dentons is the world's largest law firm and recognised by prominent businesses and legal publications for its innovations in client service. But they are pioneering the intersection of technology, innovation and the legal industry, and also exploring legislation and regulation around emerging technologies. And I think that's something that we don't talk about enough. We're all talking about bringing in artificial intelligence, machine learning, IoT, 5G, gathering data, real-time personalisation. But that exploration of legislation and regulation around emerging technologies is vital. Now, I've already spoken to guests at Dentons about smart cities and autonomous cars and that legislation and regulation that comes with that. But today, I want to explore the effects that tech and legal tech is having on the emerging cannabis industry. So come with me on a trip to California where Ausra Deluard from Dentons is waiting to speak with us about all this and much more. So a massive warm welcome to the show. Can you tell the listeners a little about who you are and what you do?
Absolutely. My name is Ausra Deluard, and I'm part of Dentons healthcare practice. I primarily focus on helping clients in the cannabis industry, and I spent over a decade practicing antitrust at Weil, Gotshal and Jones Day. And that experience really helped me to understand, in an antitrust practice, you have to understand economic realities and business strategies and bring that into your legal analysis. That background has helped me serve cannabis clients as they struggle through, the practical realities and how to solve their problems in the challenging cannabis industry today. So I continue to help them solve their problems, and I also advise on antitrust.
Well, I'm really excited to delve into this subject a little bit more. But for people that are just tuning in and possibly outside of the legal industry, they probably don't know that Dentons is the sixth largest law firm by revenue with an incredible $2.36 billion in annual revenue. But just for everyone listening, can you set the scene and tell me a little bit more about Dentons just to get everyone on the same page?
Absolutely. So Dentons is actually the world's largest law firm with over 10,000 attorneys today. What really appealed to me from Dentons is that it is really a disruptor brand. It's very entrepreneurial, despite a firm of that size. It has a huge focus on innovation, and it really welcomes new ideas. The cannabis practice is a great example. Because of the platform that Dentons provided to us, we were able to bring the practice from out of the shadows. And within 1 year, it was recognized as one of the leading cannabis groups by Law 360. They are also, one of the things that Dentons really focuses on as well is bringing a lot of the practices that the corporate world have employed and understood were important for decades now, but that haven't really filtered into or been adopted by the legal industry just yet. And so this involves things like, really investing in your people, leadership development, leadership training, and supporting technology. So one of the things that Dentons does is it actually gives people credible hours, which for innovation. So it allows people to just brainstorm new ideas and think of ways to implement them. It also partners with Next Law Labs, which is an accelerator that curates and pilots and adopts legal technology. So it really is it's a disruptor brand, it's an innovator, and these are the things that make working here so exciting.
And when you say it's a disrupting brand, it really is, because one of the things I love doing on this daily tech podcast is I love busting myths. And the legal industry does have a bit of a reputation for being slow to adapt to technological change. But Dentons proved to me that simply isn't the case. Because, for example, we've had Clint Vince, who's been on here speaking about smart cities. We had Eric Tannenblatt from Dentons as well, talking about autonomous vehicles. But the reason I invited you on today was to talk a little bit more about how technology is transforming the cannabis industry. I mean, can you expand on that for me?
Absolutely. I think if you just take a look at, what cannabis looks like today compared to what it looked like a decade ago, you can see that there have been tremendous developments in the industry. So you really see technology touching the space from a number of different perspectives. First, you have technology and analytics that have really refined cultivation, bringing forth more successful yields, better genetics, selective expression of cannabinoids. You also have seed-to-sale tracking. So states require as part of their compliance that every plant is tagged with in some states it's RFID tags. And that tag allows you to track that plant all the way through the cultivation cycle, manufacturing cycle, until the product is ultimately sold to the customer in whatever form it's ultimately sold. This technology, so you can actually walk into a cultivation room and be able to scan all of the different numbers. And this technology allows for a number of data analytics and improved compliance and trust and transparency in the industry. Some of the other exciting things as well are anti-counterfeiting products that are being brought to market. Counterfeiting is honestly an area where I see there could be a lot of concern, especially as you're seeing, there's still a lot of black market competition. In the U.S., we've had the vaping crisis where black market products have been using cutting agents that have been making people sick and in some cases even die. And so there's a true safety concern. And for the companies that are operating compliantly, they don't want consumers to buy a product thinking that it's their safe brand and then that consumer to get sick. So protecting against counterfeiting, I think, is a really important objective for the industry. And we're seeing some really cool technology coming into the space that allows companies to do that.
So can you also tell me what you think the cannabis industry can learn from the tech industry, especially in terms of merger and acquisitions? Because I know this is a topic close to your heart.
So with, in tech M&A for a while now, we had seen a lot of these sectors, they were nascent, emerging technologies. It was a dynamic market, that sometimes didn't even exist a few years before that transaction came to review before the agencies. You had increased innovation, a lot of efficiencies that were produced through these new companies, emerging technology, and also through these transactions. By being able to combine resources, you're able to create products, complementary services that you wouldn't have necessarily been able to do on your own. However, as I'm sure you're all aware, there's been a lot of scrutiny as to whether that analysis got it right, whether technology companies have gotten too big, whether they should have been allowed to acquire the companies and IP that they have. And so I think that if we were looking at the world 5 years ago, I don't think anyone would have, still today, no one would have expected that these cannabis transactions would have ever received a close antitrust review, what's commonly referred to as a second request. But given the scrutiny that these big tech mergers were under, even in nascent industries, you have the same concern with cannabis. You see the regulators being uncomfortable not knowing about an industry and not having enough data or facts on the ground to truly be able to evaluate it. So even if at first glance it looks like it's very dynamic and there's low market shares, low concentration, things are changing, the typical factors that would warrant to allow a transaction to go through, you see that the regulators are starting to pay closer attention. And so, one of the things that I think you're going to see with technology and the tech M&A is that the regulators are looking back and seeing if they got the analysis wrong. They're collecting more data to try to understand what could have happened. And I think that they're also seeing that a traditional formulaic approach to assessing whether, a transaction has caused anti-competitive effects is going to have to be expanded, and the analysis is going to have to be revised lately. I think a lot of the focus is going to, shift more towards like a vertical foreclosure. So how have competitors through various transactions been able to harm other competitors, smaller companies? And in the EU, you have abusive dominant standard that you don't have in the U.S. And so you're going to see a lot more with the rise of populism, really globally, but also in the U.S. I think you have more of a push towards protecting against big, trying to and looking closely at companies that have grown too large. So for cannabis companies that are, undergoing consolidation, even though we don't see the type of market concentration that would typically raise concerns, I think that they're going to have to be careful and expect that the agencies are going to continue to take a close look.
And before we talk about the technology, and can you tell me a little bit more about some of the challenges in the cannabis industry?
Well, absolutely. It's an industry, that's very nascent. It's still wild and unpredictable. And, it's somewhat chaotic. There's swings in production, supply, and, undersupply and oversupply. And it's an industry that's trying to, be legitimized. It's trying to, work. It's companies that are, publicly listed now, some of them at least. They're trying to operate like real businesses. And with that comes a number of challenges. So first and foremost is just access to banking. In the U.S., it's difficult. It's a true problem because right now it's still in cash, and unfortunately, a lot of banks refuse to bank cannabis businesses. So these businesses that are trying to operate like very serious and legitimate businesses, have to carry around bags of cash in order to pay their taxes and in order to pay their licensing fees or their distributors. And, as you know, trying to record and track cash can be difficult. And not only do they face those issues, but they also face a number of regulatory hurdles. So there's, sometimes in certain, licensing and compliance issues vary by state and sometimes even local jurisdictions within those states. So these companies have to comply with numerous varying regulatory requirements. They also have to, and then they also have to abide by all the same corporate compliance concerns that companies in other industries have to comply with. So these are brand new companies that have gone from working in the shadows to suddenly having to comply with a number of regulatory issues, including labeling issues from the FDA. You see that happening in CBD especially. And it's a lot to take on. Access to capital, we were talking about banking earlier, but access to capital is a real concern for these companies as well, because as long as it's still a Schedule I drug, there's a lot of apprehension. And so a lot of the typical channels that companies can turn to, especially startup companies, are not available to a number of companies in the cannabis industry. So, our clients in the cannabis industry, they're true fighters. They have to tackle problems every day, and it's a challenging environment.
And over the last few years on this podcast, I have had an increasing number of companies that believe that blockchain will play a big part in the cannabis industry by bringing in that much needed trust and transparency at every stage of the cannabis industry. I mean, is that something that you're seeing too? And what are your thoughts on that?
I agree that there's a lot of interest in how fintech can help the unbanked. And, the people who are attracted to blockchain and cannabis are typically similar personalities as far as those who are willing to take a gamble to disrupt and to forgo traditional modes in order, for the sake of progress. Yeah. As you mentioned, trust and transparency are definitely issues for this industry that is faced with severe banking challenges, where their accounts are closed all the time and they're, really stuck in a cash world. Unfortunately, the issue remains that regulators and, local jurisdictions still require taxes and license fees to be paid in cash, and Bitcoin isn't an option yet. And so at this time, we haven't seen a widespread use of blockchain in the industry, but I am certainly aware of a lot of interest in that area. And this is a very good field for blockchain to really be able to help serve the needs of an industry.
And I'm curious, are there any particular tech trends that excite you at the moment, whether that be in the cannabis or legal industry?
So as I mentioned, I think from the cannabis perspective, I'm excited about some of the anti-counterfeiting technology to really be able to continue elevating trust and transparency in the industry. I also, from a legal tech standpoint, I really love outsourcing the mundane. So I've used a number of various technologies, for example, applying artificial intelligence to identify privileged content and sensitive content in internal investigations. And this has, including second requests that we were talking about earlier. And using that type of technology has saved our clients tens of thousands, sometimes even hundreds of thousands of dollars in such internal investigations. So that's one area where I think, today it's not enough for a lawyer to just be good on their feet or, a good researcher or writer. We really do need to be competent in technology and know what is out there and how we can use it to provide the most efficient service for our clients. And so, that AI technology that I was referencing is something that I'm very excited about. And then there's a number of other tools as well, contract analyses and also automated legal research that is truly helping lawyers focus on where they can add value and not just doing a lot of mundane, low-value tasks.
And before you came on the podcast today, I always do a little bit of research on the guests, and I came across a fantastic post by you. And one of the lines that really, really stood out for me was that while the technology industry might be the catalyst for invigorated focus on exclusionary conduct, the effects will be felt by all industries. Can you expand on that just for anyone that hasn't seen that article?
So this is, I was touching on this a little bit earlier, where I really, the antitrust enforcers are under a lot of scrutiny right now by politicians on both sides of the aisle, and not only in the U.S., but also internationally. In fact, the European Commissioner, Ursula von der Leyen, is at Davos right now talking about curbing the power of Silicon Valley giants. This is an issue that's global. It's an issue that has the attention of everyone. And so as the antitrust enforcers have to take a look and try to understand, is there really a problem with big tech? Is there something that's gone wrong with the competitive process? When they undertake that analysis, the first question is going to be, is there harm? Has there been a problem in the competitive process? And if so, where did it go off track and why? And as they engage in that analysis, they're going to have to move away from the formulaic methodological approaches that they've used in the past, where you define a market and then within that market, who are the participants and what are their market power. That really limits, in some cases, the ability to correctly assess what the competitive effects may have been and where the problem may have arisen. There was also a focus on horizontal concerns when competitors in the same area merge together. And I think what we're going to be seeing a lot more of is when you ask that question, was there harm to competition? And then, work backwards from there. You're going to start to have to look at, was there exclusionary conduct? And I think there's going to be much more of a focus on that type of exclusionary concerns. And indeed, the FTC and DOJ just released updated draft guidelines for vertical merger enforcement. These guidelines hadn't been touched since 1984, and they just released this a couple weeks ago, which is showing that, and in vertical transactions, the concern is really on foreclosure and what you're doing to harm other people in the supply chain. And I think you're going to be seeing that a lot more, not just in the merger context, but also in supply and distribution agreements, and also IP acquisitions. And also, for example, retention of employees and recruitment of employees. So key engineers that are needed in Silicon Valley, for example, these are all areas where I think you're going to be taking a closer look. For example, one of the things that might come up is, are people entering into exclusionary exclusive contracts to cut off their competitors? Are they engaging in excessive overbuying, where large companies that have a lot of access to capital are locking up key resources? And, there is some support in jurisprudence to support those types of theories, but it is a little bit risky because the courts haven't quite gotten to that yet. And so I think a district court might be reluctant to support some of these more novel theories. Although you did see, the agencies trying to bring vertical foreclosure concerns, for example, in the AT&T Time Warner transaction, which, they weren't successful doing. So I think you're going to have to take a look at that. And you've seen that for sure in the tech industry. You've seen that with, Apple is notoriously known for, demanding very, as some people might term, excessive supply terms, in which they definitely have priority and depending on the size and bargaining position of the counterparty, exclusivity. And they've used this exclusivity, for example, to just lock up key supply. So they had an agreement with Star Glass, I believe, and they actually made the supplier go bankrupt because while they had this exclusive contract, they absolutely didn't demand any supply from the supplier. And they had the contract, and in effect, what the contract did was keep that supply of the sapphire glass out of the hands of other smartphone manufacturers. So I think taking a closer look, the agencies, are looking at what happened with the smartphone wars back in, 2010, 2011, 2012, would be an interesting analysis. And Apple actually just acquired Intel's modem business in the summer of 2019. And so it'll be interesting to see as well whether the agencies are taking a closer look at such IP acquisitions and especially how they relate to some of the smartphone IP acquisitions that happened back in 2011. For example, when Google acquired Motorola Mobility and when Apple acquired a number of patents as well. So I think as those types of concerns are going to be at the forefront of, really examining what's happening in the tech industry. And as that type of analysis evolves and people start to focus more on those concerns, they're going to be applying those antitrust principles to all of the other industries that they review and examine. For example, healthcare. And you already see that happening as well, where you see the agencies and state AGs starting to look at healthcare contracting practices and seeing if there's, any type of contracting provisions that are really foreclosing competition. So you'll really see as they're pushed to evolve their antitrust policy, from a number of different political angles, I think you'll see a shift in some of the antitrust practices and enforcement.
It really does feel like you're navigating uncharted waters at the moment, which must feel incredibly exciting. But looking towards the future, I've got to ask, are you optimistic about the road ahead? And what are your biggest challenges that you're going to have to overcome over the next 12 months and beyond, do you think?
So I am definitely an optimist by nature, although I think life lessons have taught me to be more of a practical optimist. Yeah. Some of the concerns that I see is I do think that we are going to see a correction in the economy. I think that we have seen a lot of overvaluation, and so you're going to see more of a focus on value rather than just growth, which I think had, really been a key factor in a lot of the investments that we had seen in the past few years. And so I think that it's going to be a challenging environment as, people live through that adjustment. There was a lot of money spent on investing in growth. and it's going to be hard to kind of come back to reality and focus on what is actually profitable and what are tangible assets, rather than the overvaluation of intangibles. For me, I think my biggest challenges are speaking truth to power, and knocking down barriers that stand in the way of progress. We fight the fight for our clients every day, trying to help them solve their problems. And a lot of that is, communicating where the problems are and trying to reform policies, sometimes through legislation, and speaking to regulators and helping them understand the economic realities and practical, challenges that businesses face, while also being able to bring more trust and transparency into the industry.
And for anyone listening that would like to find out more information about the kind of work that you're doing here, both with technology and in the cannabis industry, can you just point them in the direction of the best place to look online, and also contact your team if they do have any additional questions?
So I'm fortunate that I have a fairly unique name, unless you go to Lithuania where everyone is named Ausra. But my name is spelled Ausra. So you can look me up on Dentons' website. And I also have a LinkedIn profile under my name, Ausra Deluard. And my email address is ausra.deluard, DELUARD, @dentons.com.
Fantastic. Well, when you first came on and said Dentons was a disruptor brand, I suspect that some people listening throughout the world would have gone, "Oh, everyone's a disruptor now." But the fact that over the course of the last 12 months, I've spoke to several people at Dentons now about smart cities, autonomous cars, and now cannabis, and that tells me that tech is at the very heart of everything that you do at Dentons, and possibly bust that myth once and for all that the legal industry is slow to embrace tech change, because you're proving that with your actions and the great work that you're doing. But more than anything, just a big thank you for joining me today on the podcast. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Neil. It was a pleasure.
Wow, I cannot thank Ausra enough for coming on the show today and talking about the great work that they're doing at Dentons. And like I said at the very beginning of this podcast, I think the exploring of legislation and regulation around emerging technologies is so important. And the lack of it in the past is half the reason we're seeing so many problems today around the likes of Facebook, etc. But I'm curious, do you have any insights around tech and the cannabis industry? Maybe you want to share something that you thought we didn't cover today and we should have. Whether it be just a question or a request to come on this podcast, all you need to do is email me, techblogwriter@outlook.com. You can catch me on any of the social channels at Neil C. Hughes. And my website is techblogwriter.co.uk, where you can find every episode that we've recorded. We are approaching 1100 now, and also a little bit of information about the new book that I've got on Amazon, which is due for release in May. But enough from me. I hope you enjoyed today's podcast as much as I did, and I'll see you all again bright and early tomorrow. So a big thank you for listening, and until next time, don't be a stranger.
Thank you for listening to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast with Neil C. Hughes. Remember, technology works best when it brings people together.